All right, well, it's 11 o'clock, so let's get started. This is Meagan Wolfe, Administrator of the Wisconsin Elections Commission, who will open up with the statement, and then we'll get to your questions.
Great, thanks Reed, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We thought it would be a good opportunity to make sure that we're answering questions as we head into tomorrow's election. There's been a great deal of preparations that have been put in place at the local level and the state level to prepare for tomorrow, but we know that with the changing environment that there may be some confusion about processes, deadlines, and other things, and we wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to answer those questions. I also wanted to take an opportunity to thank all of our local election officials for just the incredible amount of work and undertaking that they've done to prepare for tomorrow. In the most decentralized state in the country, I think that their effort has just been absolutely, truly remarkable. And so thank you to each and every one of our 1,850 municipal clerks and 72 county clerks for the incredibly important role that they play in making tomorrow possible. Also, thank you to our other partners in this process in developing public health guidance and other documentation to ensure that voters and poll workers know how to conduct an election under these extraordinary circumstances. So my sincere thanks to all of them. And again, I think that the most important point of this media availability today is to make sure that we're answering questions and that we can ensure that voters have access to the correct information so that if they would like to participate in person tomorrow, or if they are finalizing their preparations to participate by mail, that everyone understands the deadlines in the process that would need to be followed. And so with that, I will turn it over to all of you for any questions there are about preparations for tomorrow.
So I've Adam Brewster, your question.
Hi, Megan. Thanks for doing this today. The Republicans, the RNC and the Wisconsin GOP in the legislature in their filing seem to suggest that that Judge Conley's order preventing results from being released on April 13th didn't necessarily apply to municipal clerks. Is there anything that the commission or the state can do to prevent municipal clerks from releasing election results before the 13th, and what would the enforcement mechanism for that be?
Great, thank you so much for your question. That is a very important one. So our understanding of the court's order, as well as the guidance that we've put out for local election officials. So we've put out copious amounts of guidance on election night processes for the local election officials, and we've made it very clear that they cannot complete the tally or release any unofficial results prior to 4 p.m. on Monday the 13th. Anything that is released prior to that date would be in violation of a federal court order. That being said, how that process looks and the preventative measures that will be in place will vary by jurisdiction. So some jurisdictions that may have more modern voting equipment, they're able to hold that equipment in suspense while the tally is while the votes are continuing to be cast through the equipment, and it will not allow them to produce a result set until the end. Other jurisdictions that may be hand count jurisdictions or jurisdictions with older voting equipment, we've asked them to wait to do their tally until the 13th. If they do have to produce any sort of unofficial result set, there is a very strict chain of custody document and procedure in place to ensure that only those that need to have access to any unofficial tallies will have access to that. Things like tamper evidence seals to ensure that nobody is able to access those things have also been a part of our guidance and our procedures. And so again, this is something that's incredibly important, and we've made sure that clerks understand that they would be in violation of a federal court order if they do not heed to that guidance.
All right. Next is Riley Vetterkind.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So we are getting some reports, I think other people are as well, of people not receiving their absentee ballots or their ballots being delayed or needing to request their ballots multiple times. To what extent is this a problem that you guys have noticed, and how are you addressing it?
Thank you for the question. We are not aware of any problems sort of on our side, so I actually have spent a great deal of time myself and had our whole staff analyzing the system to ensure that there aren't any delays caused by the MyVote system or the WisVote system, and we feel very confident that there's no delays being caused on our side. That being said, I think we all have to recognize the incredibly unprecedented process that the clerks are undertaking here. So the clerks are dealing with absentee requests at a volume that they've never experienced. And so some of them are experiencing delays in terms of their ability to send out to the absentee requests to voters. And so I think the Postal Service at times can have delays as well. And so people, I think, continuing to track their ballots, to check in with their municipal clerk if they believe that there is a ballot that hasn't been received yet. But we've also been on our side sending out reminders to the clerks on a regular basis of absentee ballots that have been requested, but that we don't see in the system have been fulfilled. And so we're asking them to check, double check, recheck to make sure that every single absentee ballot has been sent. But we're not aware of any widespread issues either in the statewide systems or in the Postal Service that's affecting one place in particular.
All right. Let's see. Next is Ben Meyer.
Yes. Can you hear me, Reed and Megan?
Yeah. I just one other thing. Ben, can you see Megan's video now?
I can. She popped up within perhaps the last 30 seconds, so I can see her.
Okay. Apologies. Again, we're just figuring out this Zoom thing. So thanks.
Sure. Megan, does the Wisconsin Election Commission have power to lobby the Department of Health Services to impose an order suspending in-person voting tomorrow? If so, is that something the Election Commission has considered or done?
So the Elections Commission role as an administrative agency is to implement the law. And so if the law were to change or if there were to be guidance that directs us to go in another direction, then our role again would be to implement whatever that change is. But in terms of lobbying, that is not traditionally the Elections Commission's role. Our role is also to provide feedback. So if someone were to ask us for guidance on how a change would impact the process and other things that need to be considered, that's also something that we do on a regular basis, is provide that type of feedback. But we are not, our commission has not adopted a direction in terms of lobbying any particular organization to solicit changes.
All right, next is Scott Gerard from the Cap Times.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. First of all, how is the state's poll worker shortage looking? And I know National Guard members have been called in. Are they able to fill the gap that exists there?
Thank you for the question. And as you referenced, we've done surveys with our municipal clerks, and as of a few, I guess we're bordering on a week or two now since that survey was initially launched with the clerks, they reported to us that there were about 111 jurisdictions that were experiencing a critical shortage of poll workers and 126 that were experiencing a serious lack of poll workers. Since then, a large number of jurisdictions have consolidated polling places, so they've chosen to operate a fewer number of polling places, therefore needing a smaller number of poll workers as well. As you also referenced, yesterday, the National Guard did conduct intake with nearly 2,500 service members with the National Guard. Now, these National Guard members, they are serving as poll workers in plain clothes in the counties and communities where they live and reside. So these are your neighbors, your friends, your family, people that live in your community that will be serving as regular poll workers at the polls on Election Day. They actually reported to their counties today to receive additional training, and in addition to the places where we know there's a need. So if we knew there was a municipality that had a need to be able to open their polling places tomorrow. They've actually been deployed to that municipality today to train with them on the specifics of that polling place. And then there's an additional reserve pool of guard members and poll workers that are continuing to be trained, and if an emergency arises tomorrow. So if there's a last minute change or a last minute shortage or a place that's unable to open, that they've been trained to be able to step into that situation and assist with opening the polling place. So as of right now, counties and municipalities are reporting that there are Guards members that reported in every county to again serve in that reserve capacity and to ensure that any critical or serious gaps are being filled.
All right, next is Lou Ragusi. If I pronounced your name wrong, I'm sorry.
That's okay, it's Ragus, but no problem. I'm wondering if you have an estimate of how voter turnout will be affected, and if you have hard numbers of how much more absentee voting there has been up to date this week.
Sure. So when we look at turnout, all we can really do is look at historical trends and historical numbers. So if you're looking at the 2012 presidential preference, there were about 1.1 million voters that participated in that election. If you look at 2016, it was a record-setting election in terms of the presidential preference, with just over 2 million voters participating in that process. And so right now, we're seeing that entered into the statewide system, there are about 1.3 million absentee ballot requests that have been entered. Again, there may be clerks that are continuing to enter those. Even if they've sent the ballot, they may not have done the data entry into the system yet. So by the end of the day, we should have a better understanding of exactly how many ballots have been requested and issued across the state. And so in terms of who might show up to vote tomorrow on election day, again, we can kind of look at those historical numbers and potentially assume that it may be in between those two numbers, but we really have no way of knowing exactly what voter behavior will be and how many people will choose to participate in tomorrow's election in person.
All right, next is Alex Seitz Ward.
Hi, thank you for doing this. Could you speak to some of the social distancing measures and other precautions that you've advised at the polling places, especially in places like Milwaukee that have really consolidated their polling places, and so you're likely to see more people in fewer number of places?
Great, thank you for the question. So as you referenced, there are going to be differences in terms of the polling place facilities you might see in a small township and a larger jurisdiction. We've put together guidance and actually sent paper copies of things like a public health checklist for polling places, as well as signage that can be used at every polling place. And so one of the pieces of guidance is that each polling place needs to determine how many people can safely accomplish social distancing while occupying that facility. And so if they determine that a total of 20 people can be in the facility at once in terms of poll workers, voters, and observers, then they're going to need to enforce those limits to ensure that social distancing can occur. And so again, people might be asked to form lines outside of the building so that they are only allowing the appropriate number, which will vary by each polling place, into the facility at a time. They'll also be asked to make sure that people are practicing good social distancing while they're waiting outside as well. And so you may see some new roles at the polling place this year in terms of there are often these greeters or other helpers sort of at the polling place helping people understand the process. And so also having those folks outside of the polling place to again make sure that they're setting expectations for voters about who will be allowed to enter and what they should do while they're waiting outside. There are also a number of signs that we've sent to every polling place. So we've sent 2 signs to each polling place to put on the entrance, the door, the window, to let people know that they should not enter if they are experiencing symptoms. It will then provide a phone number that a voter is able to call if they need to do what's called curbside voting because they are unable to enter the polling place. Once a voter enters the polling place, they're going to see signs about social distancing. They may also see lines on the floor indicating 6-foot markers in places for lines, poll books, registration tables throughout the process that they should make sure that they're paying attention to. Voters are also going to be asked to sanitize their hands upon starting the voting process. So in our work with public health officials, the focus has been on hand hygiene as you're starting the process, and then again as you end the process of casting your ballot. And so there may also be helpers making sure that people understand how to queue in line and making sure that people are sanitizing their hands before starting the process. In addition to lines and making sure that people are practicing social distancing, you'll also need to make sure that you're following the poll workers' directions at the poll book and photo ID table, as well as the registration table. So we've provided guidance and signage, videos to the local election officials about how a voter, there should be a marker of 6 feet away from the table where they present their photo ID on both sides. And what this allows is for the voter, when instructed, to step up to the poll book table, set down their photo ID while the poll worker steps away while the person's at the table. Then the voter is going to be asked to step 6 feet away from the table while the poll worker comes up and looks at the ID. They will not be handling it, but they'll be looking at the ID as it's set on the table. Once the poll worker has done their review, they will open the poll book to the page that the voter needs to sign, and again, step away and then ask the voter to step up and sign the poll book. Each voter will be provided with their own pen to sign the poll book. They can either take this with them or dispose of it after they use it to sign the poll book. The same at the ballot casting station. So when they cast their ballots, they might either receive their own pen or a ballot marking device specific to that voting equipment that has been sanitized for their use. And so you'll see social distancing built in to every step of the process, from waiting outside to enter to standing in line, and then again at the photo ID and poll book table and the registration table. So please do listen to the direction of your poll workers as they'll advise you exactly how social distancing will apply to their facility.
All right, just a second here. Next is Francisco Almenara.
Hi, yes, Almenara. I know you kind of addressed this before about the absentee ballots. I, for one, have not gotten mine yet, and I know some of my colleagues haven't gotten theirs yet, but we've heard reports that some of the absentee ballots might have been lost in transit. I was just wondering if you had heard anything about that.
Like you, we've heard individual reports of people who have not yet received their ballots. We've taken a look at the statewide system to try to understand if there's any issues in those being entered or being reported. We have no reason to believe that that's true. We have a log of every single move that's made in the statewide system, that's made on the MyVote system to ensure that we capture those requests. And so we've also reached out to the Postal Service. We're not aware of one central location that's experiencing issues. We've also been in contact with them about how they're handling election mail. We've also been in contact with the clerks and encouraged them to work with their local postal service. So depending on where you live, depends on where your mail is routed. And so in some places, if your mail is routed through a certain facility, we've encouraged the clerks to work with that facility to try to do things like capture the mail that is being sent to them around election day so that they can pick it up rather than it going through the transit in the mail. So we're not aware of any large, widespread issues with a particular place having these issues, but we, like you, have heard of people that are experiencing delays in receiving their ballots. We know that the Postal Service has advised that mail can take up to a week to be received by the voter or by the clerk on either side of the process. If you are experiencing issues, I think talking to your municipal clerk, you can also check the status on myvote.wi.gov. If you requested an absentee ballot, you can click on Vote Absentee, enter your information, and see where your ballot is at in the process. You can also go to My Voter Info to check that progress as well. And so that'll allow you to see if the ballot was received, if the request was received by your clerk and when they sent it to you, as well as if you've returned your ballot, if it has been received by the clerk. But understand that there could be some delays in their data entry. And so if you have questions about the process or if something doesn't seem right, you can also call them to inquire about the exact status of your ballot.
All right, next is Pat from WisPolitics.
Hi, Megan. So I wanted to follow up on the initial question about election night reporting. Obviously, results can't be reported, but I was curious if any other data such as turnout might be able to, and if not, how that would kind of compare back to the Elections Commission, which has already released data on absentee ballots being returned.
Sure, good question. So what we've been advising clerks is that the number of ballots is something that they need to make sure that they have a good handle on, right? So on election night, they need to know how many ballots they had, how many ballots they have custody of, and how many outstanding absentees that they still have, so that they're again able to execute those chains of custody and other checks and balances in the process. And so in terms of how many ballots were issued on election day, how many absentees were issued, those are numbers that could be provided, but the actual tally or how anyone voted or who's the winner of a contest is not something that can be available until the 13th. And again, if it was released, it would be in violation of a federal court order.
All right, next is OG Menez. OJIMENEZ. Sorry,
Can you hear me there? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sorry. It took a second for me to unmute you.
No worries, no worries. So it's Omar Jimenez from CNN here. Hey, thank you, Megan, and thank you, Reed, for doing this. One of my biggest questions is kind of what's been the biggest challenge for you all in making sure this election actually happens, given the unique circumstances? And is there any concern from either yourself or municipalities that continuing the in-person aspect of this, I know you're bound by a court order, but continuing the in-person aspect will contribute to the spread of coronavirus in Wisconsin?
Sure. Thank you for your question. I think, in terms of concerns, our focus has been ensuring that our local election officials have the supplies and the personnel that they need to be able to conduct the election on Tuesday, and also providing that guidance for them in terms of what the public health guidance is specific to elections. So as we've been saying throughout, we are not medical professionals here at the Elections Commission. We know the ins and outs of election laws and election processes, but we have to rely on the guidance from our public health officials in terms of how to operate that process. And so with all the processes that surround in-person voting, be it in-person absentee or election day at the polls, we've worked to prescribe some of that guidance so that clerks have the most up-to-date information about how to operate. One of the other challenges has been, of course, the changing environment. There's been changing instruction in terms of elections because of court intervention or other messaging that might be out there. And so making sure that voters have the correct information to be able to participate is also a challenge in terms of, making sure, again, that they have access to that information and that the local election officials are able to keep pace with the changing information as well. The same applies to public health guidance. Those are things that change on a daily basis. And so making sure that everyone has the most current information in this ever-changing sort of environment is certainly a challenge. And that's why we're doing things like this, is we want to ensure that people have the most current information and know what the expectation is in terms of how they can, if they choose to, interact with the election process safely.
All right, next is Dakota Shrek, I think. Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's Sherrick. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. My question is, do you believe with the sheer number of absentee ballots requested, plus the reports of people who haven't gotten theirs yet, that the 13th is a big enough extension to get this done in that time?
So again, as an administrative agency, we have no ability to sort of prescribe those deadlines or dates. Our job is to implement the law or the court orders in terms of that. And so again, anytime that there's a new deadline imposed, our challenge is to make sure that we're implementing it, that we find a solution. I think as election administrators, it is just our nature to find a way to implement or overcome any challenges that we're faced with. And so, I think messaging is really important for voters to understand how to interact with that deadline. And so to that effect, voters should know that under the current court order, that if they have an absentee ballot that they've already completed and need to return, they have a couple of options. If they think they have enough time to mail it, they can certainly mail it to the U.S. Postal Service, and it has to be received by their municipal clerk no later than 4 p.m. on Monday the 13th. They may also have other options if they would like to deliver their ballot either to their clerk's office or to their polling location. Many municipalities also have things like drop boxes where a voter might be able to drop off their ballot if they want to deliver it outside of the Postal Service as well. And so I think, our focus right now is, again, just making sure that voters know what the terms are of how they interact with the process and what the precautions are that have been put in place so that they can do so safely.
All right. Next is Tom Lally from WAOW in Wausau.
Hi there. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we are.
So my question is, it's looking ahead a little bit. How is this primary shaping your preparations for the November election?
I'm certain that once we are beyond the April 7th election, that our attention will turn to, again, providing feedback about how processes may need to be modified for the remainder of the year. But right now, it's the task in front of us is a bit.
Sorry, I accidentally muted Megan when trying to unmute somebody else. Can you try again, Megan?
Sure, thanks. I was saying that, right now our focus is on April 7th and also May 12th, the 7th congressional, and making sure that we're providing guidance and support in relation to those elections. But I'm sure after the conclusion of these elections, our attention will turn fully to working with lawmakers, state leadership, to provide information about how the process worked and any potential impacts or modifications that will need to be made for the elections for the remainder of the year.
All right, next is Michelle Langer.
Megan and Reed, thank you so much for doing this. So you mentioned in the documents that you guys sent out this morning that curbside voting will be available in some locations for people who are feeling unwell but still need to vote tomorrow. Can you kind of explain the process behind that and how you'll be keeping poll workers safe, assuming if some of these people might have COVID-19?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And so, as with all of the election day processes, we worked with a public health official to determine what the guidance should be for processes like curbside. And so curbside voting, again, is only available to voters who are unable to enter the polling place on election day. And there are some exceptions built into the law about that process. So, for example, the voter does not sign the poll book, so that is one risk factor that's removed. We've prescribed as part of the curbside voting procedure, especially if somebody thinks that they may be ill, where there would continue to be sort of a physical barrier between the voter and the poll worker. So, for example, things like showing your photo ID. The person that's voting curbside would not be passing their photo ID, and that's actually true to the polling place too. They're not actually passing their photo ID to the poll worker. They could do things like hold the photo ID up to the glass of their window on their car for the poll worker to observe. There's also a process for transferring that ballot. So perhaps the voter would receive the ballot through a small crack in their window and mark it, and then they would put the voted ballot into something like a ballot sleeve or a bucket for a poll worker then to transport to the voting equipment to be counted securely and privately. And so there are procedures built into the process in terms of how the poll worker should interact with that person and in terms of the voter behavior that will have to be adjusted to ensure everyone's safety.
All right, next is Eric Lindquist. Eric, are you there?
I was wondering for voters that are actually showing up at the polls tomorrow, if they can expect to see all the poll workers wearing masks or some type of protective device on their, on their bodies, and if you're advising voters to wear masks as well, or if any will be provided.
Thank you for the question. So there was a supply of masks that were sent to polling stations around the state, so that poll workers in some roles will have masks in most locations. So, there's some roles where they may have more exposure to folks than other roles. And so, there's a limited supply, as there is in any industry or sector right now. There's a very limited supply. And so there were masks issued to the polling places for the poll workers, and it'll be up to the jurisdictions to allocate them appropriately so that the poll workers are protected. There are not enough masks in the supply chain, or that we were able to procure for elections for them to provide one to each voter, but voters can certainly choose to utilize a mask if they'd like to as they come to the polling place. You'll see other safeguards in place as well. There are a lot of jurisdictions that are doing things like putting up a plexiglass barrier at some of the tables. So in addition to sort of the social distancing measures that we talked about, where the voter and the poll worker will always maintain at least 6 feet, you may see other precautions such as those physical barriers at your polling locations as well. But again, we've instructed the poll workers on what they should be doing in terms of exercising good hand hygiene, making sure that all the poll workers have an opportunity to get up and wash their hands or sanitize their hands every 10 minutes. And that they're avoiding doing things like touching their face. And so the guidance that you see out there for the general public, I think very much applies to what voters should practice when they go to the polling place on election day as well.
Victor Jacobo, do you still have a question?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Hi, I guess with obviously the shortage of poll workers, I was wondering if there's been any way the Elections Commission has been able to address any shortages specifically with special needs workers or bilingual workers who may have stepped away because of concerns of COVID. And kind of tied to that, I guess, were there any geographically or specifically any priorities for the supplies that the commission sent to?
So in terms of the poll workers, when we worked with the National Guard, they recruited service members from all 72 counties to again serve as poll workers in the communities where they live. And so we were able to find those individuals to help again in all 72 counties so that we can address some of the shortages and ensure that polling places are able to open on election day. There were also some other efforts that helped to mitigate some of the needs for additional poll workers, like consolidation. A lot of jurisdictions are choosing to consolidate their polling places for election day, so there were fewer poll workers that were needed. Today, again, all of those service members reported to their home counties to receive additional training and then to receive their assignment for election day. But we do have also a reserve pool of individuals that if there is an emergency tomorrow, that they'll be able to fill in that role. So those service members, they are now certified as poll workers. They went through more than 2.5 hours of training yesterday so that they understand all the various roles of being a poll worker, in addition to some of the new roles like what we're calling the helper, which helps people to make sure that they're maintaining social distancing and things like hand sanitation that they can also assist with. And in terms of supplies, so the supplies that were procured were based on a request from the municipalities. So we did multiple surveys with the municipalities to understand their needs for supplies. And then we were able to procure enough of those supplies for each jurisdiction to have what they needed to operate election day. So things like the sanitation solution that we provided for hands and for surfaces, there is enough of that that's been sent for each polling place to have access to at least 2 liters of that solution. So again, there were supplies provided to all the jurisdictions and in anticipation that they would all need something and that we were able to make sure that they had those things. Emergency management was also able to procure a large supply of things like pens to make sure, again, each voter has their own pen when signing the poll book and potentially when marking the ballot as well.
All right, I'm working through the list of people who've got their hands up, so please be patient. Next is Alexa Corsa from the Wall Street Journal.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
We can.
Great. So 2 questions. The first is, the Supreme Court could decide to roll back the extension for absentee balloting. I mean, from your perspective, like, how would you deal with that, or what logistical challenges would that present? Actually, I may have forgotten my second question, so go ahead.
Okay, so thank you. So in elections administration, change is normal for us. There's always last minute changes and decisions that have to be made. And so as we always do, we start to prepare for those changes. And so if there is a direction that's changed and it's something that we are able to anticipate, we anticipate that we'd be able to get out information to both voters and clerks very rapidly so that they knew what that change was. And so, there's things like making sure we have press releases. We do a lot of training with our local election officials about making sure that they have information prepared in the event that something changes. And so we're also doing those preparations in addition to how would we communicate to all of our local election officials if there were a change as well. And so those are things that we have in place that we would be ready to, again, get that information out to them right away if there were some type of a change. But we never know for sure if there will be a change or if we are going to continue to operate under the current arrangement. And so it's something we're pretty well practiced in, though, is making changes at the last minute. And so we'd make sure that we got that information out as soon as possible.
All right, next is Sam Levine, and on deck is Ben Jordan.
Hi, Megan. Hi, Reed. Thanks so much for doing the call. I was just wondering if you could, if you guys had an estimate on the number of ballots that you expected to arrive after election night. I know there was a number that was thrown out last week in the court hearing, but if you had any kind of estimate about the number of those ballots.
Unfortunately, that number is really difficult to anticipate because the volume of absentee requests is unprecedented. We've never had this series of events or this type of voter behavior. So we're not sure. Again, we're trying to put out information to voters about their option to return ballots, as well as what the current deadline is for returning those ballots. But I guess it's to be seen what will happen on election day or in the week after the election day leading up to April 13th in terms of how voters interact with the process and how many ballots are returned. And so I don't think that in this election, those historical markers of what's happened in the past, we don't know how accurate or how applicable those will be to the current situation. And so unfortunately, that's to be seen, but we're hoping that there'll be transparency in the process and that local election officials will keep people informed in terms of the number of ballots that are being received. Again, they cannot release the actual tally or who was voted for, but in terms of the number of ballots, making sure that we're being transparent about how many are still outstanding and how many have been received.
All right, next is Ben Jordan, and on deck is Henry Redman.
Thanks, Megan, for taking my question here. What advice does the Wisconsin Elections Commission have for voters who missed the early voting and absentee deadline, and they're worried about health risks of going to the polls tomorrow? And secondly, would you happen to know how many of those 2,500 Wisconsin National Guard members who are going to be at polling locations are going to be in Milwaukee County?
Thank you for your question. So in terms of the polling place tomorrow, I'm sorry, you might have to repeat that first part if you could unmute him, Reed. I didn't quite catch the first question.
I think he was asking what advice you would have for people who are going to the polling place on election day.
Great, thank you. Sorry, the phone's cutting out a little bit. So in terms of advice on election day, A couple of things. First is that, each polling place is going to look a little different. And so making sure that you're following the instructions of the poll workers is going to be incredibly important. Those capacity limits of how many people can fit in a facility safely while accomplishing social distancing, the setup where you're going to have to do things like sanitize your hands, where the lines will form. Those are all things that are going to be very dependent on the voter making sure that they understand and they're getting direction from the poll worker. So we ask for your patience. This is new to everybody. This is new to voters. This is new to the poll workers. And so I think, patience is going to be really key in this process. The same with election night results. We're not going to have election night results on election night. Again, you'll know the number of ballots that were sent, the number of ballots potentially that were returned, but we will not know the tally until April 13th. And so I think patience is just going to be incredibly key. And I know that everyone, voters, clerks, everyone are trying their very best to adjust to these new procedures and these new processes. And so I think we just need to all exercise extra patience with one another in making sure that we're following directions as we're all trying to figure this out for the first time. And so I think, voters, please, when you go to the polls tomorrow, understand things that will look a little bit different. There'll be different procedures than you're used to. Please follow the direction of your poll workers. The procedures that they're prescribing are there to help keep you and them safe. And then in terms of the Milwaukee numbers, I don't know specifically how many they're receiving in Milwaukee County. I also know that there are some what we call cross-leveling happening as well. So today, the Guard members that are residents of particular counties reported to their home county. If, let's say, there are more service members that reported that are needed in the county, they may be reallocated to a neighboring county to serve in some of those helper roles, line management, hand sanitation, things like that, to another county that could use additional help. And so those numbers could change. Again, it's all meant to make sure that we're able to open the polls tomorrow and that there's someone filling the roles to accomplish all these new processes that are happening at the polls.
All right, next is Henry Redmond. I'm sorry, go ahead, Henry.
Hi, thanks for doing the call. You mentioned you're already looking a little bit ahead to the May election, but we're not far off from candidates in the fall starting to need to gather signatures. Have there been discussions about how that process is going to work?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I know that is absolutely one of the next things on our list. And so, everything has been changing so rapidly that our full attention has been on supporting our local election officials, getting information out to voters for the elections that are in front of us. But absolutely, the next time our commission meets, we're going to have to consider what happens with nomination papers as we look forward. Again, our agency is always in the position where we only are here to implement the law, implement whatever the court rulings might be. We're not in a position to change the laws. And so we'll have to take a look at the statutes as they stand and see how we might be able to accomplish that process in a way that adheres to public health guidance. So just like we did for all the other election processes, taking a look at nomination papers and how we can merge that public health guidance with the statutory requirements.
All right, next is Todd Richmond.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Maybe I misheard this at the outset, but I thought you had said that you're asking clerks not to count the absentee ballots until April 13th, not to even count them until April 13th. Is that correct?
So there's a distinction between sort of counting and processing and tabulating. So in some jurisdictions, depending on the type of voting equipment they're using, they'd be able to do things like put the ballots into the tabulator to start processing them without running any sort of tally. So some of the newer equipment has sophisticated audit features and other programming where they would be able to start processing the ballots. So if it's a large jurisdiction that has a large amount of ballots, they might even be canvassing every day in that week between the 7th and the 13th, but they would not be able to produce a report that had any sort of a tally. They wouldn't be able to produce a running tally, but they can process the ballots. Now, in some jurisdictions that hand count or don't have that type of equipment, there isn't a way to do that, and so we ask that they wait until the 13th to process those. But the good news there is those would be much smaller communities, so processing the ballots at the end of the process is much more feasible in those jurisdictions. If there are situations where they have to produce any sort of a result set, we've also prescribed procedures where, again, they keep those secure, they keep those confidential, and they cannot release them unless, or they would be violating a court order. And so, you know, how that actually happens in terms of the processing is going to look different in the communities depending on the type of voting equipment or hand counting that they do. But the bottom line is nobody can release a tally or a results set publicly prior to the 13th at 4 p.m.
All right, next is Patrick Marley.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Thanks for doing this. We appreciate it. I know you're extremely busy right now. One thing I wondered about is earlier you had said that there would be more than 100 communities, or at that point, that did not have enough poll workers to open a polling location. Have you been able to fill the gaps with the National Guard? Are there any towns that aren't going to have a polling station? And if so, what happens to the voters there?
Sure. So thanks for the question. And, you know, it's my understanding as of today that we have more than adequate support through the National Guard to ensure that the jurisdictions that had critical shortages are able to achieve the staffing needed to open the polling location. So I'm not aware at this point of any place that is stating that they're unable to open their polling location tomorrow. But again, that's why we have a reserve pool of individuals that if there is an emergency that they'd be able to step in and help in that process. So there may be circumstances that we're not yet aware of today. Again, as the most decentralized election structure in the country, we have 1,922 local election officials. And so we're relying on the counties very much to be our partners in this and to have a pulse on exactly what's happening today and tomorrow in terms of ensuring that the polling place is open and that there is personnel sent there if there's any question about their ability to open. As we've also seen in some of our scenario-based trainings that we've been doing with the clerks over the last couple of years. So we've been doing a lot of security-focused training that ends up being very applicable to this situation. And a lot of those trainings deal with things like consolidation of polling places if a polling place is unavailable. Is there the potential to move to a neighboring town or some other jurisdiction? How do you post notice? How do you make sure that people know about that change? And so these are things that are part of the clerk's normal contingency plan. But again, tomorrow, along with the partnership of the municipal and county clerks, we're going to have to, I'm sure, troubleshoot various situations as they come to our attention throughout the day.
All right, next is Monique Lopez from, I believe, Fox 11.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hi, thank you. So, you know, undoubtedly all of these changes are going to take more time this time around. How confident are you that, you know, everybody will get, you know, to vote in a timely manner?
So there's two methods still remaining for people to cast their ballot. So if someone is unable to complete their, wasn't able to request an absentee ballot, they'll have those opportunities tomorrow in person, either at the polls in a traditional polling sense or curbside if they have some concerns that make them unable to enter the polling place. Also, if somebody has received a ballot, or let's say that it's in transit to them and they receive it tomorrow, the day after, they're still going to, under the current court order, have the ability to return that ballot either to their clerk, to their polling place, or to another location like a drop box as well. And so again, I can't predict exactly what voter behavior will be, but we know what the guidance is for voters and are making sure that they understand the steps that they need to follow to make sure that their ballot is cast. Another thing that I didn't mention earlier is that the commission did consider the definition under statute for hospitalized electors and decided that that process does apply to people that are in quarantine. So if somebody was planning to go to the polls on election day and then their health condition changed, they would be able to exercise the hospitalized elector process if they're in quarantine, where they have a courier that is picking up the ballot for them and delivering it to them. And that process is available today as well as tomorrow on election day as well, if people find themselves in sort of these last minute critical circumstances.
Okay, I've been watching the hands up, and the next question is from the last person who had their hand up for the first time. We can go back to some second ones unless anybody else wants to raise their hand. This is Matt Finn. Your question, Matt?
Yeah, so just to clarify, the actual counting of votes will start on April 13th. Do you expect final results on the 13th as well?
So again, we're making this distinction between processing and tallying. So the final results set will not be able to be made until April 13th. The municipal clerks have to go through their board of canvass. The county clerks have to go through their board of canvass. So the results will still be unofficial on April 13th. And some of the jurisdictions will need to conduct some. It'll take a while even on the 13th for them to continue. And so they've been instructed to make their very best effort to comply with the statutory deadlines for completing their canvasses. But that, in this process, I think speed is not the objective here. If you want safe elections, if you want secure elections, if you want elections with integrity, those things all take time. And so I think in each of these communities, again, that's going to be a little different in terms of exactly when they're able to certify the results at the local level before they're submitted to the state. But one thing will be absolutely consistent throughout, and that is nobody will know the unofficial tally, the unofficial results of any contest, national contest, state contest, local contest, until 4 p.m. on the 13th or after. So that's the very first time at which a jurisdiction can release those result sets.
All right, going back through another question from Henry Redman.
Yeah, you talked about having the National Guard in reserve in every county, but is there the possibility that a polling place is unable to have a chief inspector because they have to be from that community?
So thank you for your question. Again, we were able to find service members that reside in all 72 counties. So, thank you to that incredible effort and their willingness to serve in this capacity. So all 72 counties have received service members that are residents of their county. We also provided them with a large amount of training that they all completed, including chief inspector training. So in all of those counties, there are individuals that have been trained in all the roles on election day, including chief inspector, so that they're able to serve if there's any sort of outage. There are also some provisions under the law where folks can be deputized as deputy clerks in the event that there is an emergency shortage as well, and there's an out-of-county resident that needs to participate. And so all of those procedures have been outlined, and we've trained all of these service members in all the roles for election day. And again, they are residents of their county, so that they'll be able to serve in whatever capacity they're needed.
All right, next is Mayan Silver from Milwaukee Public Radio.
Hi, I have a question. I'm not sure if you spoke about this already, but there are some voters that are concerned that this in-person voting is going to potentially suppress turnout because people aren't going to want to show up on election day. Do you have any information that this would affect urban areas more than rural areas?
Thank you for your question. I unfortunately do not have any information like that. We do not track information such as that here at the Elections Commission. All we have to really rely on are the historical turnouts. And so, perhaps some of the local jurisdictions, if there's a specific area that you're interested in, may be able to provide it more information. There are historical reports about turnout by reporting unit that are available on our website. But again, I have no idea what voter behavior will look like, or because this is such an unprecedented election, if historical estimates of voter turnout or voter behavior apply to this election. That is to be seen.
All right, next is Amy DuPont.
Good morning. In some of your, like the 10 things that you pushed out an email about things a voter should prepare for, it asks for patience. Have you at all been able to estimate how much longer the voting process will take when you talk about the extra sanitizing and handing out supplies and stepping up and stepping back to sign the poll and show your ID? Any idea if you've at least guessed at how long it'll take to get through the process?
So we don't have, estimates on that. I mean, it's going to depend on your polling place. We don't know. Are there going to be lines tomorrow? Will there be large amounts of people? There may be some communities where the turnout is, where most people have cast a ballot by mail and the in-person turnout is low. We do not know how many people are going to show up in person to vote on election day. So in terms if people will face lines, we don't know the answer to that. We do have videos and other instructional demonstrations of the process available on our website. And so it gives you some idea of what that process looks like. It's not as if, a 1 minute process is now going to take 10 minutes. These are asking somebody to step forward and step back doesn't take a significantly increased amount of time. Sanitizing someone's hands as they're in line, I don't anticipate that that's going to take a significant amount of time. But again, I think we all are doing this for the first time. Poll workers are doing this for the first time. Our whole country is doing these things for the first time. And so I think patience is key. I mean, I think we all owe each other a little extra kindness through this process to make sure that we're working through these changes together.
All right, next is Pat from WisPolitics.
Hi, Megan. I wanted to follow up on the question I asked earlier in terms of election night data. You said that turnout on election night were numbers that could be provided. I'm wondering if you've issued any guidance to either county or municipal clerks about how they're going to provide that data, and I guess where it's going to be provided. Is it through the WEC site or county or municipal websites? How is that going to work?
So that is a good question because, number of ballots that have been returned and, what the actual turnout was at each polling place, that's all going to be in the inspector logs that the clerks are going to go through on election night to make sure that they can account for the number of ballots issued versus people that have signed the poll book, all of those things that they do at every election to make sure that there was no issue that they need to address. And so there isn't a centralized process built for that, for them to report that type of data to us on election night. So the statutes prescribe and the county and state systems are set up for those unofficial results sets, but we don't currently collect any other data about sort of turnout or outstanding absentees on election night, because that's just not part of the current process. And so, I can't foresee a situation where we're able to build something to support that sort of election night reporting infrastructure before tomorrow. And so I think the local election officials are going to be the best source of that information as they're doing their canvass, as they're doing their election night processes. These are all open, publicly observable meetings. And so, just like everything else, there are going to be some changes and restrictions in terms of people's ability to appear in person to watch. But we've also instructed them, like we've been doing at the Elections Commission, how they can accomplish public meetings remotely and using other means. And so, I really do think that that's information that's going to be available at the municipal level. And there's nothing built right now to allow them to put that information in a central place, unfortunately.
All right, we've got another follow-up from Ben Meyer from WXPR.
Hi again, Megan. I know you had mentioned a couple of times that the elections in the fall are way on the horizon. You're just trying to get through tomorrow. But I'm specifically curious about the 7th Congressional District election here in northern Wisconsin, which is just more than a month away on May 12th. Has WEC had discussions about special procedures or timelines for that election?
So thank you for the question. And, as you probably know, ballots for the 7th Congressional have already gone out. So that election is already underway. The statutory deadline to send out ballots is 47 days prior to the election. And so that election is also in progress. We'll do the same as we have for the April 7th election in terms of providing guidance and information, but we don't have the authority to change any date, deadline, procedure that's prescribed in the statute. And so if anything were to be adjusted for the May 12th, 7th Congressional, again, just like it was for this election, that would require the legislature to act or an intervention of the courts or potentially an order of the governor to be able to change those dates. So we don't have any sort of discretion to change dates, deadlines, or procedures that are prescribed in the statute, but we certainly will be here to support them in the 7th Congressional and to make sure that they have all the resources and information and even lessons learned from April 7th that we can make sure we augment to support them for the May 12th 7th Congressional special election.
Another question from Meagan Silver from Milwaukee Public Radio.
Oh, no, sorry, I'm good. Just that one question.
Okay. Next is Matt Finn.
Yeah, quick question. You mentioned right now that you have about 1.3 million absentee ballots that were requested or entered, but back in 2016, there were more than 2 million votes. So just, simple math indicates there's hundreds of thousands of more votes out there. Any concern that the reduced number of polling locations or relocated polling locations is going to have an impact on people who still want to physically cast their ballot?
No, I apologize. I don't have that information. I don't know what voter behavior is going to be tomorrow. So we don't know what the turnout is going to be in person. We know how many ballots have been requested. We know how many ballots have been issued and returned. But who is going to appear in person at the polls tomorrow, we don't know that. And all we have is historical data to look back on.
And then quick follow-up, if I may. Can you just clarify quickly what the commission has done to help voters figure out where their new or relocated polling location is, especially those who aren't tech savvy or online?
Sure. So we have the statewide voter registration database with which our local election officials use to do everything elections related. So everything from nomination papers to issuing ballots to printing poll books, to setting up what we call their election plan to tell us where their polling locations are, and then where we can geocode and assign voters to their appropriate polling place. And so clerks, as there are these changes, and I'm sure there'll be additional changes today and tomorrow in terms of consolidations or changes of location, they have to enter that into the statewide voter registration database. That's the only way we know at the state if they've changed their polling location. In a large election, there can be between 2,000 and 3,000 polling places, and so those changes have to be entered into the system. Voters would then be able to look up on myvote.wi.gov what their polling place is. They can also call us at the Elections Commission, and we'll look that up for them as well. So if they call 1-866-VOTE-WIS, that's our help desk, and we can help them find their polling place. And also we've been, again, instructing the clerks that they need to make sure that they're noticing this change within their community. So if they have a public building like a city hall or a town hall, or if they have a usual polling place that voters have been used to going to for years and years, they should be posting a notice on the door of those locations directing people who might show up to the correct place. And so it really is a coordination between the local election officials and making sure that they're entering and providing that information, and then we'll do what we can to make sure that people have access to that information, both online, by the phone, and if they do appear at their old polling place, that they know where they should be directed.
This is Reed. Just one other follow-up to Matt's question about turnout and the 2 million from 2016. That was an election, that was a record turnout for that election. We had, hot primaries on both the Republican and Democratic side. So that isn't necessarily the benchmark of where this election would be. Next follow-up is from Alexa Corsa.
Hi. I'm curious about, absentee ballots that haven't been sent out yet. I mean, according to the data that you released this morning, there's still about 11,000. Is there I guess that seems like that would be a problem for those 11,000 voters who requested absentee ballots.
So first of all, we don't send out ballots at the State Elections Commission. Ballots are sent by each of the 1,850 jurisdictions. And because of all the unprecedented volume of absentees, some of them may send out the ballots. They track the ballots in terms of that they've sent it, but they haven't done the data entry yet. They haven't been able to enter the data into the statewide system to show that it's been sent. And so you'll see that, historically, as the days pass, more and more get entered into the system. And so we've also been sending reminders to the local election officials. If we see that there are requests that are still out there that are not showing as sent, we've been sending them spreadsheets to make sure that they understand that they need to double check and make sure that all the ballots get out in time for them to get to the voter and for the voter to get back. And so with the extended time period, as clerks continue to send out ballots, because again, the deadline to request a ballot was also extended by the court through Friday for voters to be able to request a ballot. And so over the weekend, clerks were certainly still processing those and sending those to voters that may have requested it on on Friday. And so we will know as they continue to enter that data into the system. We'll continue to remind them to make sure that everyone that requested a ballot has indeed been sent one.
All right. We got two more questions, and then I think we're going to wrap it up. Next is Monique from Monique Lopez from Fox 11.
Yes. Hi, Megan. So I know you've mentioned a few times, that the WEC doesn't have the authority to change dates or processes, but I'm just curious, how do you think this election would have looked had you guys had that authority?
I can't answer that question. So the commission, we're overseen by a bipartisan commission who meets to discuss matters involving elections and in some cases to prescribe directions. And so, as of right now, they haven't contemplated sort of what an election would look like under alternate conditions, because quite frankly, I don't think that would be a productive exercise. We're tasked with implementing the law and implementing court decisions and overcoming challenges. And that's what our agency continues to focus on, is implementing what's before us rather than sort of contemplating the hypothetical.
All right, last is Riley Vetterkind.
I just wanted clarification on the National Guard workers. So 2,500 working at the polls, and correct me if I'm wrong there. But then I also saw a report about as many as 5,000 or more that I think was that the legislature had reported. So I just wanted to have you reiterate those numbers.
Sure. So you're probably referencing the survey that, again, at this point is a few weeks old. And again, the clerks were asked to indicate to us so that we could try our best to help them in filling shortages. So doing things like press and putting out calls, giving them templates to put out calls in their communities for additional poll workers. And since that original survey was done, where they were able to indicate sort of what their need was. So was their need critical, serious? Was it, something where they would prefer to have more, or, did they feel like they had enough poll workers? And at that time, before a lot of polling place consolidation and other things happened, they indicated a number that would allow them to comfortably hold elections. And so based on a lot of those numbers, I'm sure municipalities made decisions like consolidation to ensure that they had enough poll workers. And so that survey, again, indicated about 111 that at the time indicated a critical need, and about 126 that indicated a serious need. And so with the additional assistance from those service members, we are able to make sure that all the polling places have the support they need to be able to open on election day. I'm sure there are places that might be operating with 3 election inspectors on election day that would prefer to have 7. They always have to have an odd number, but that they have enough staffing to be able to conduct all those critical roles and make sure that they have the numbers to be able to conduct the election in their polling place.
All right. That's it for now. Thank you very much, Megan, for doing this, and to everybody who attended. If you have additional questions, please email me. reid.magny@wi.gov. That's reid.magney@wi.gov. And I'll do my best to get back to you. Anything else you wanted to add, Megan?
No, just thank you all. We really appreciate your assistance in helping us to make sure that voters and the public know exactly how to interact with the process tomorrow, and that you're helping us to get the word out. So we really appreciate you taking the time and again, making sure that all voters know what the expectations are as we head into tomorrow. So thank you.
All right.
This program is a production of WisconsinEye, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit media network with a mission to inform, educate, and engage the citizens of Wisconsin. WisconsinEye is the nation's first and only independently funded state civic broadcast network, providing gavel-to-gavel access to government proceedings and events at the state capitol.